We have to break the power of we need justice. And we have to be people who say, no, we need reconciliation. And by the way, in reconciliation, there is a line of justice. I don't want you to say, we just been, I'm watching what's happening with IHOP. And by the way, I want to say publicly, I love Mike Bickle. I don't know what the outcome will be, but it won't change the fact that I love him.
In 2023, shockwaves were sent through the International House of Prayer in Kansas City after founder Mike Bickle was accused of grooming and sexually abusing a teenage girl while serving as a pastor at a St. Louis church in the 1980s. A leaked email sent in April 2024 confirmed that the IHOP-KC organization was no longer financially viable and would be, quote, closing for good in a staggered fashion. Though IHOP-KC cut ties with Bickle in December 2023, fallout from the scandal continued for months. Several other women came forward with similar claims, and IHOP-KC's Forerunner church was forced to close amid the scandal. This presented a huge problem for leaders of the NAR. Mike Bickle was an apostle and part of the NAR network of apostles and prophets. IHOP-KC was integral to the NAR's apocalyptic end-of-days theology, and the prayer center was part of prophetic history. NAR prophet Paul Cain claimed to have seen a vision of Bickle creating Joel's Army, a militant group of so-called prayer warriors that would be the final stage in the Manifest Sons of God predictions of the latter rain movement of the 1940s and 1950s. But instead of creating Joel's Army, Bickle apparently created an unsafe place for women in the church. How did this happen? How were the NAR apostles and prophets so blind that they missed what was happening at IHOP-KC? To find out, we must examine the early history of the ministries during the 1980s when victims claimed their alleged grooming began.
It was in the 1940s and 50s when the Pentecostal movement really started I realized in 1906 in Azusa Street, but it became big in the 40s and 50s, the healing revivalist. Some of you are aware of that. Up until now, very few healing ministries in history were ever known. Maybe they were some, but they were not well known globally. 40s and 50s, a whole new group of ministries. Like 50 or 100 of them. They had big tents. Paul Cain was one of the young people with a big tent of 12,000 people. Oral Roberts, William Branham, guys like that. A. Allen, Jack Coe. There's a bunch of them. They had big tents. But the thing that characterized not all of them, but many of them, was the showmanship they brought to the platform. They just carried on. The flamboyant, the antics, that everyone knew. They were the reason the power was in the building.
In 1972, NAR apostle Mike Bickle converted to the Pentecostal faith at the Evangel Temple in Kansas City. It was there that he first experienced glossolalia. Evangel Temple was led by Reverend G.W. Hardcastle Jr. and was well respected among Pentecostals for its youth programs, outreach, and revivals. During the healing revivals of the 1950s, Evangel Temple hosted internationally recognized faith healers and evangelists, attracting large crowds of people. Through the years, Evangel Temple was also known for its theatrical religious events. From musical performances to artists featured on The Lawrence Welk Show, to Christian comedians, entertainers, gospel according to the Peanuts cartoon, and more, the church had built a reputation for attracting new members using a combination of entertainment and preaching. The year Mike Bickle first experienced Pentecostal tongues was no different. Evangel Temple had invited the unusual California evangelist Marvin Schmidt to host an old-time religious entertainment program. Schmidt was well known for his dramatic performances as a modern-day apostle. Part of his performance included the so-called slaying in the spirit, wherein a person approached him filled with such religious ecstasy that they fell over backwards. As many as 1,700 people per night attended, and almost 1,000 people signed cards stating that they had been given the gift of speaking in tongues.
I had a brother who was totally paralyzed for 33 years. He's with the Lord now. He broke his neck in a high school football game. And so I went to the rehab center in Colorado for nearly about a year, several visits, and all these young people in a rehab center in Denver, Colorado. And I saw the most remarkable thing. I would see a nurse, saw it a couple times, who was a worker who fell in love with the patient. I mean, they're paralyzed, quadriplegics, paraplegics, different accidents. I mean, it was a trauma center. And when the worker became a lover, the worker threw away the checklist.
The next few years were difficult for Mike Bickle. In September 1973, his brother, Pat Bickle, suffered a severe spinal cord injury, leaving him paralyzed for life. Mike, who was enrolled at the University of St. Louis on a football scholarship at the time, took a leave of absence to move to Denver to be with his brother. A few months later, in 1974, their father, Bob Bickle, suffered a heart attack while visiting them and died. Believing that a miracle from God would soon restore Pat Bickle, Mike Bickle remained by Pat's side. Mike began preaching at a non-denominational church called the Upper Room in the small town of Rosebud, Missouri. Mike convinced Pat that he was going to be healed, and Pat declared his faith in the miracle to the newspapers. In February 1977, Pat believed that God audibly spoke to him, assuring him of his complete recovery. The brothers later moved to St. Louis, where Mike preached at a non-denominational church called New Covenant Fellowship. Mike cared for Pat while Pat sued several defendants who made or sold football equipment for $10 million. Sadly, Pat Bickle never recovered. He died in 2007 due to complications from his accident.
Leadership lesson. This is a really important one. When God transitions leadership, there is crisis and danger when that happens. I remember the Lord spoke to me some years ago, in September 1982, in a very dramatic way, and told me He was going to change the understanding of and expression of Christianity to the earth in one generation. And I was so excited.
It was not long until the leadership of the New Covenant Fellowship recognized the power of Mike and Pat Bickle's highly publicized story of tragedy, faith, and hope for a miracle. While serving as youth pastor of the New Covenant Fellowship, Mike connected with the Full Gospel Business Men's Fellowship, the same organization that sponsored William Branham's meetings during the healing revivals of the 1950s and 1960s. Their influence played a key role in the trajectory of IHOP-KC. Bickle and the other Kansas City prophets told fantastic tales of visions, spiritual experiences, and angelic visitations linked to Branham's ministry. According to Bickle, one of the FGBMI ministers had a vision of him leading hundreds in worship, which he claimed to have fulfilled as a charismatic youth minister. It was during this time in the early 1980s that the first signs of trouble in Bickle's ministry began to emerge. Bickle formed a partnership with the interdenominational Lindbergh Assembly of God Church in St. Louis, and the group began expanding its youth programs. Child care centers at the church were understaffed, relying on overwhelmed middle school children, leaving unattended infants screaming for hours on end. Numerous complaints were filed with the state of Missouri, reporting that children were being beaten, clothed in dirty diapers, fed from a common cup, and left to watch television for several hours. However, there was very little the state could do in the matter, due to the child care operation being managed by the church. When Bickle mentioned the St. Louis church plant in his literature, he failed to mention the name of the church he planted or its partnership with the Assembly of God Church. This is likely due to the fact that details later emerged of an alleged financial scam. After Bickle left the South County Christian Fellowship for Kansas City, the minister he had partnered with, Gene Putnam, was accused in a civil suit of making fraudulent claims to secure donations. Whether or not similar funding strategies were in place during Bickle's time as head pastor of the church, it is clear that things at South County Christian Fellowship were not what they seemed. It was in that church where the earliest accusations of sexual misconduct by Bickle would emerge. According to Tammy Woods, Bickle had sexually abused her as a 14-year-old girl in his car, in his home, in the church, and even in his office.
I have taken these 4 Friday nights and shared 2 one-hour sessions, which are primarily stories of what the Lord has done in our past, starting in 1982 and 83 and 84. And I thought in 4 Fridays, 8 sessions, I'd cover enough of it, even though I know there's about many hours of stories more than that, but I came up a little short, so I'm taking Sunday today to give 2 more sessions. So it will end up a 10-part series of our prophetic history, which are the supernatural events that the Lord confirmed that are to give us confidence in his leadership of what he's doing in this city, in this region.
Sadly, the accusations made by Woods are not the only ones against Bickle or those involved with the formation and leadership of IHOP-KC. Over the years, many voices have risen against the group to form what appears to be a pattern of abuse. How did Mike Bickle rise to become such a well-respected apostle of the NAR? How did his around-the-clock prayer center become such a focal point for NAR agenda, both political and spiritual? To find out, we must examine the early formation of the International House of Prayer in Kansas City and its connection to key movements within the history of the NAR.